So industry standards, subscription pricing, some lessons learned and ideas and thoughts around optimizing subscriptions to standards and increasing customer adoption. I think most of you probably know me at this stage, but if not, my name is Jonathan. I'm an engineer by training, and I created Nimonik in 2008 and have been running it ever since. So of course, very involved with our partners, our publishing partners, as well as our customers and our development and sales teams. So just a little bit about Nimonik for those of you who maybe don't know us quite so much. We're based in Montreal, Canada, with over 50 staff now. I've kind of lost count, honestly. I remember the good old days when it was just 3 of us sitting around a shared desk. So anyways, enough reminiscing. We have team members in the United States, throughout the US, Canada. We've now hired someone in France to serve our European customer base. And we have a team in China, and we also just recently hired someone who will be based out of Dubai to service the Middle East and Indian markets. So Nimonik is very much a global company, and we also have partnerships with various organizations in Japan, Chile, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere to serve customers in those markets. So about 900 customers today that purchase standards and regulatory data from us and use our software. We do tend to focus on businesses with 500 to 30,000 staff, so what we consider mid-sized businesses, but of course we have larger companies, some of their logos on the right here, and we have smaller businesses as well. So last slide about Nimonik before we get into the meat of today's presentation. Nimonik is really about getting all of your requirements in one place, and we think those requirements come primarily from 3 places: industry standards, regulatory information, government publications, and then companies' own internal documents. So this can be licenses, permits, engineering documents, contracts, and all of these things have a lot of requirements in them, and businesses and organizations need to access and manage them. All right, so into the meat of today's presentation, talk a bit about why pricing optimization matters for businesses in general, organizations in general, some of the SDO and NSB business models, the objective of subscriptions, some common pricing models and constraints we've seen, platform fees, considerations in the market, and then some pricing principles and best practices that we see, not specific to necessarily SDOs and NSBs, but just in general around intellectual property licensing and things of that nature. And we don't pretend that we have the answer for any given NSB or SDO. Everybody is unique and has their own constraints, but we just want to share some thoughts today. So a little bit about pricing optimization. So, of course, many organizations around the world don't have a standard subscription. In our experience so far, we've seen very large companies, 2,000 engineers, and they don't have a centralized standard subscription. So our anecdotal evidence is that there are a lot of high quality large companies that haven't established a centralized standard subscription for various different reasons. And we hope that some pricing, will play a role in getting them over to a subscription. So for any organization, whether it's Nimonik as a business or SDOs and NSBs, we think it's super important to review periodically your pricing models. There's no one size fits all, and the market is changing, the dynamics are changing, and so it's super important to constantly review and optimize your pricing models. And the goal that we have, both at Nimonik and with our partners, is we firmly believe that companies are willing to pay a fair price for the products and services they obtain. They want to have a positive pricing experience. They want to have clarity about what drives the price and the value they're going to get out of it. So proper pricing for standards, the goal really is to increase the access to these essential documents, get those companies who are not subscribing to subscribe, and generate more revenue for the SDOs, the NSBs, to be able to invest in further development of standards and value-added solutions. So the goal here is to get more subscribers who renew more, who pay more, and who get more value out of standards. That's really our goal. So what we've observed in the marketplace so far is that there are different SDO and NSBs, and they have different business models. So some are very standards driven. Their revenue is primarily tied to standards, and some of these, one that comes to mind here is ASME. I think 70% of their revenue is driven by standards. You have others that are more membership based, where members pay a fee and that funds the organization. I think organizations like AWS and IPC are very members focused. There's other organizations that offer accreditation services alongside their standards, and that can drive a lot of revenue. Organizations, such as CSA, UL, and others. You then have some that offer a more freemium open access where they don't necessarily charge for standards. This is often the telecommunications industry where interoperability is key. There are government-funded SDOs and NSBs where the government is paying for the operations of the organization. But more often than not, it's a combination of revenue streams. I don't think any SDO or NSB is 100% dependent on a single revenue stream. So it's a combination of all these things that can be tailored and played with based on your constraints and your opportunities. So the objective of subscriptions, in our mind at least, is threefold. And this is kind of true for all subscriptions, whether we're talking about Netflix, Spotify, other subscription services we use on a regular basis. More often than not, the companies that are running these have three core objectives. So one, increase the number of subscribers. You want more people subscribing to your services and your content. You want to improve the renewal rates. Getting a new customer is costly and expensive, and so you want to make sure they renew. That's super key. And then third, this is not rocket science. You want to improve the revenues per subscriber. So basically drive more revenues per subscriber by offering more value, by offering, better pricing, and other things like that. So these are the three levers, if you will, that any subscription business has to play with. And when you play with all three levers, you get a compounding effect. And I think this is one of the most important things to think about when it comes to subscription optimization and pricing optimization. Is it's not 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. It's actually 1 + 1 + 1 equals 3 point something. And so if this example here, which is some sort of anecdotal evidence, or not sample data, I should say, if we increase the number of subscribers by 2% and we increase the renewal rate by 2%, and we increase the price or revenues by 2%, we actually drive more than 6% growth in top revenue. And this is, of course, compounding year over year. So if you do this every year or at a certain frequency, you start to see some really substantial benefits. So this is where it comes back to, periodically reviewing pricing, reviewing your models, working with your partners, whether it's aggregators or other partners, to see how you can optimize these three levers. And it's a constant thing because the market is always changing, customers are changing, partners are changing as well. So in terms of the revenue models that most publishers have with resellers or aggregators like Nimonik, what we've seen is basically two models. One is a royalty model where the publishers work with us. Either they provide a calculator or we create a calculator together that allows us to calculate the royalty that is owed to the publisher based on the configuration of the customer. So then we'll go through the typical configuration. So royalty model is basically there's a hard price, a royalty that we as a reseller need to pay to the publisher. We can, of course, mark up the price as much as we like within the constraints of the market, but we have a hard price we're paying to the royalty. The publishers have a certain clarity and assurance of the money they're receiving from us. And so that has a lot of benefits for the publishers because it just gives you that predictability and planning. The other model that we've seen, which we don't use at Nimonik, but we know some other companies use, is a revenue share model. And this model is often used by smaller publishers. And I would say it's certainly very beneficial to the aggregator. And the revenue share model is basically saying, we're going to sell your content, your standards, and potentially other documents, and we're going to pay you a percentage of our sales. But the floor or the base price of what we're selling it for is variable. So if today, I'm selling it for $1,000 and I'm remitting, say, 40% is the revenue share, I give you $400. But next year, if I decide I want to lower the price of your services or your products from $1,000 to $500, I'm now paying 40% on $500. So it gives the aggregator or the reseller a lot more flexibility in terms of how they price your content. And all you get at the end of the day is a check, and usually you don't even know who the customers are. And it creates a lot more variability and unpredictability for the publisher. So we certainly recommend not doing it this way if you're a publisher, but we are aware that certain publishers still do it with certain aggregators. Very beneficial to the aggregator, not so beneficial to the publisher, in our opinion. So in terms of the models and the parameters that we see in the marketplace. Basically with the four main ones that we see are not named users. So some publishers price based on the amount of actual users that have access to the content. The pro of this, or the sort of the advantage of this, is you really match the price with the size of the user base for a given customer. The downside, I would say, is that you're potentially treating power users and occasional users of your content the same. In any organization, you're likely to have some people who are using your standards very often for core products and core product development or core operations, and then people who periodically need to check the standard to make sure things are being respected and what have you. And if you use a named user model, it can become challenging in some situations to provide a good price. The second one, the simultaneous user model, where you limit the number of people who can look at your content at any given time. And typically you start at 2 users and then it kind of goes up. So it gives the company more flexibility in usage. So you can have those power users who are using your content every day. The occasional users can come in and look at the content on a need-by-need basis. So it has more flexibility. It kind of comes from the world of physical libraries, where you would physically take a book out of the library. And so that was sort of one simultaneous user, and a library had to buy more books to be able to lend out more books. So it's a weird sort of transition from the physical world to the digital world, but it has some benefits for sure. The challenge, I would say, with simultaneous users that we've seen is sometimes a bit difficult to explain to buyers, especially first-time buyers. Eventually you get used to it, and it can be a bit challenging for companies to manage. And it should be noted that there are workarounds in most companies where if you're using the standard offline, it doesn't count towards a simultaneous user. And so that feature or element kind of throws a wrench a little bit in this model. But it's a good model, and I would say it's quite commonly used. The third one is locations or sites. So the number of locations and operations that a company wants to have these standards at. So it maps somewhat to organizational size because you're talking about a number of locations. But I think this is one of the most problematic elements of the pricing models that we've seen is, remote work, people working from home, poses a challenge for counting the number of sites. And then sites can vary tremendously in size. I mean, you can have a large manufacturing operation with thousands of people or hundreds of people, and then you can have an office where it's just some service engineers that are working there, and maybe there's 5 or 6 people, and charging the same amount for a 1,000-person manufacturing site and for a 5-person operation. Very often the customers find that not great, let's put it that way. And then, of course, some of the aggregators will play games with the number of sites. And then to counter that, the publishers will have to approve quotes and check it against the historicals. So it's pretty common. We certainly think there's better options in the marketplace, but we understand the desire to do it through locations of site. And the last sort of model for pricing is membership fees or discounts for members. The advantage here is you keep a relationship with the end user of the customer of the standards. And if it's linked to prices where you're offering member discounts on retail purchases, but you're not offering them on subscriptions, it can create a challenge for the customer where they say, well, it's a lot cheaper to buy retail because we get our members discount. Whereas with the subscription side, we don't get a discount. And so it becomes much more expensive. And then passing through membership, are they a member? Are they not a member? Through aggregators also creates a challenge, more administrative fees. So, all of these have pros and cons. We don't want to say that there's any one solution, but it's things to think about as you're developing your pricing. All right, so typical standard subscription models. I think most people on the call will be familiar with this already. You have publisher collections that are defined by the publisher. If you need all the documents in that collection, those are usually great options, but they become expensive if you only need a small number of documents within the collection. Custom collection, which I think is something that was highly pioneered by TechStreet over the years, allowing customers to pick and choose the documents they need. It gives the customer the sense that they're only paying for what they need. And the consequence, though, is you end up selling your more popular documents a lot, but some documents are never sold or rarely sold. Whereas if you put them into a collection, those documents that get less visibility through a custom collection get more visibility through a publisher collection. Blocks. So some publishers offer blocks where basically A customer can say, I want 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 documents. I don't know which ones yet, but I might want, I know I want these 5 right away. And it allows them to add more documents throughout their subscription period without incurring additional costs. The benefit for the publisher is you get the money up front. So even if they don't use the full block of 10 documents, they only use 5, you're still getting paid for 10. So it gives flexibility to the customer. It gives upfront money to the publisher, and it creates, I'd say, a relatively nice relationship. So we definitely advocate for blocks. We think there's a lot of benefits. There is a management related to that. You know how many are left in the block, and someone needs to manage that. So there's a bit of cost, but it's not so bad. And the last model in the subscription world is aggregator collections. So collections that are put together by the aggregator. You could call it like upstream oil and gas, and it will have documents from different publishers in that collection. So that has advantages for the buyer in the sense that they can buy a collection and they kind of get everything they need from different publishers. It has a lot of benefit for the aggregator, because the aggregator, what they'll do typically in these situations is they'll put documents into the collection that have a higher margin where they're making more profit. And this allows them to sort of play with the numbers and make sure they're getting a certain profit through these collections. And the cost of the individual documents or of the individual publishers is sort of masked from the client side, and they can blend it. And especially for organizations that are on that revenue share model that we discussed, where the aggregator is giving you a percentage of sales regardless of the sale price. If you have that revenue share model in these collections, what will happen is they will take the stuff where they have a good margin and they can lower the price to allow them to sell other documents at higher margins. So it's a way for the aggregator to control the margins and what's being sold. The cons, often customers will end up getting documents they don't need. Publishers lose visibility into what the customers are buying. It's very often customers will end up paying twice for the same content, because you might have the same content in multiple collections. So if you buy an aggregator collection and you buy a publisher collection, you sometimes will have overlap there. So you're actually paying twice for the same content, and the customers don't even realize it, quite honestly. But we think it's not fully transparent. So these are some of the models. Again, there's pros and cons to each. So some particularities we've seen in the SDO world, which we found interesting, is some publishers require that for a subscription, a certain number of documents be purchased or a certain amount of money be spent. So there's like, we don't offer a subscription under $1,000 or under 15 documents. That has some logic in sense of you have administrative fees you want to recover as you're offering subscriptions. So it's definitely something that can make sense. What we kind of think about there is maybe there's a minimum block that you want to offer, so the customer doesn't feel like they're paying for something they don't need. You instead say, well, you got to get, you have 10 documents, you can really pick the documents you want if you want to really achieve that minimum spend. But there is downside where, if you have too high a minimum spend, it discourages certain companies from switching to a subscription. In the NSB world, there's this really weird situation with ISO adoptions. We know that ISO is thinking about changing this down the road, but for now, some NSBs adopt ISO documents and then offer them as a national adoption at a reduced rate compared to the ISO standard. So that's a particularity for the NSB world. And hopefully that situation will change over the coming years. Monopolies by geographic territory. So a lot of NSBs, particularly more than SDOs, of course, will say, we want to maintain our monopoly in France or in Italy or wherever that might be. And they say, if you want to buy our standards in France, you need to buy from us. That would be AFNOR in France, or Italy has their own. So that, I understand the appeal of like wanting to control a territory, but by reducing the number of options in a market, you are basically, giving the customer less options, and the customers may not be happy with the option provided by the organization that has the monopoly, and therefore, instead of getting a subscription from them, they just don't get a subscription. So whenever you reduce options in the marketplace for any sort of product, you typically decrease sales. I mean, it's less things to buy, less options that suit different types of organizations. You're going to have a negative impact on sales. That's almost universally true. Minimum spend we already spoke about. And then exclusivity. So there are some SDOs that only offer their content through select partners. They create exclusive agreements. We think that's very detrimental for the SDOs. Again, you're limiting access to your content, and you might get some sort of supplemental payment from the organization that's giving you the exclusive agreement. But fundamentally, you're limiting access to the content. You're forcing people to go buy a certain product that may not correspond to their needs. And so some of those organizations may say, hey, we don't want that product, so we're going to keep staying on retail. So it contorts the market. And there are very few companies in the world that do exclusive, channels where they say our product is only available in this channel. Of course, it does exist, but it's pretty rare. Again, the less options a customer has to buy your goods and services, you're just going to impact your sales in a negative manner. And even if you get an upfront payment for the exclusivity, I would venture that it usually doesn't offset the decrease in sales over time. All right, platform fees and considerations. So both aggregators and some SDOs have their own platforms, and some charge fees for access to the platform, some don't. There's no universal rule. I think the thing to consider here is that platforms cost money to maintain, and that's even more true today with cybersecurity, data privacy, all the infrastructure that's required to maintain a modern platform and to meet the IT requirements of the customer. So it's something you need to think about is developing a platform and maintaining it are very costly endeavors. And you want to make sure that you can recover those costs and avoid sort of sometimes a sunk cost fallacy where it's like, well, we just spent $1 million or $2 million on this platform. Therefore, we need to, force people to use it by limiting sales of our products to just that platform. Again, you potentially are affecting the amount of people that take subscriptions in the first place. So you got to think about that in a clear way. And again, it's going to be very contextual to the organization. So what are we hearing from the customer? What's the customer voice saying? What we see is that there is a willingness to pay. People are happy to pay for a standard subscription if the pricing makes sense, if it's mapped to their organizational reality. But if the price is perceived as disproportionate with their organization and with their ability to pay, the reality is what they do is either they do one-time retail purchases and it's sort of distributed within the organization. If there isn't tough DRM, because some places, some SDOs, NSBs, and some retailers might not have a strong DRM, they end up sharing the documents internally. And we've seen this firsthand. Or they just don't buy them, or they resort to piracy and get them, in an illicit manner. So willingness to pay is there. They're willing to pay, but the pricing models need to map to reality. Variables you want to think about that the customers think about is like, hey, I'm a company of a certain size. I'm in a certain geography. Certain countries have more respect for intellectual property than others. And how important is this standard to my business? So there are standards that are probably core to the business. And then you typically will have standards that are more sort of nice to haves. And those factors will influence the companies or the buyer's decision to pay. More often than not, companies go with a hybrid solution where they have a subscription for the most critical documents, but they will often go and purchase individual documents through retail to complement that subscription. And potentially, if with the right pricing model, you can move more of that into a subscription model, which gives you the recurring revenue. But it's something to think about. Frustrations we hear from the customer. Unforeseen price changes. So when prices change or pricing models change, that can create frustration with the customer. I think that's true. You get an alert from Netflix or Spotify, and the change is coming right away. That's very frustrating. So one of the tactics that these streaming companies have done is they say, we're going to do a price change, but it's only going to come into force in a year or in 18 months. And when you do that, the customers who stay with you kind of give you a tacit approval for that price increase, because it's like, hey, we told you 12 months or 18 months in advance that our pricing model was going to change or that our prices were going to increase. And it gives them that, if they don't stop subscribing, it's kind of demonstrate that they're willing to pay that supplement. So giving them visibility can offset the frustration. And then, anything that, again, reduces the access to your standards by exclusivity or by having pricing models that aren't flexible at all, minimum spend, things like that, what's going to happen? I mean, ultimately, they don't take the subscription, they go back to retail, they go back to piracy. So you got to really think about all the hurdles you put in place to get a subscription. Each of those hurdles inevitably has an impact on your sales. So you got to just think about that very carefully. So transparency at Mnemonic, one of our values has always been transparency with our customers, with our staff, with our partners. And we've seen that customers greatly appreciate seeing the cost by publisher of how much of my API documents costing me, how much of my CSA documents costing me. They don't need to know like every single little document, but they want to know by publisher. And that comes back to having transparency and not putting everything into a collection. They want to be able to play with their subscription and say, this year we're going to focus on these standards. And what we've seen in the business world is companies that have fairly transparent pricing. If we think of Costco's famous for working on a 7% margin. So all the products you buy in Costco, they more or less guarantee that they're not charging you more than 7% of their cost. And then you pay a membership fee to Costco, which is where they drive a lot of brand loyalty as well as some profits. But that transparency on pricing is often greatly appreciated by customers. You can think of other companies that do that, like Walmart and IKEA and others, where you're getting a very good price, a very fair price. Other things we hear from customers that I think are quite important. So two things. One is pricing speed. When they contact us for price for a subscription, they really love getting a fast turnaround. And we do our best to do that. I think we're pretty good. But they like to have a fast turnaround if they want to change the subscription configuration, fast turnaround. And that requires, in some cases, collaboration with our SDO partners when they have to approve the quotes. But we know that customers like fast turnaround. Who doesn't? I mean, who wants to wait in line for a product when you can get it faster? The other thing they like to see is equal pricing across their options in the marketplace. So they want to make sure that if they go to one company, they're going to get, the base price. There might be some fees on top of it, but the base price is sort of similar across the organizations. You often see this with companies where they say, we'll match the price of our competitors, whether it's retail companies, things like that. So equal pricing across the network is important, and that requires the SDOs and NSBs to have a standardized pricing that they apply to all their resellers, and we definitely advocate for that. So a couple principles now on pricing. So you always want to, it's a balancing act, like with everything, you need to analyze your competitors. In many cases, the SDOs don't have a competitor. You have a monopoly on your IP. But you want to analyze the marketplace, the products, the users, trends, customer behavior. There is no one size fits all. Everybody has to do their own thing. You got to determine what the customer pays and how do you differentiate between the customers based on a set of variables. And that's where this idea of fencing comes in. So fencing is a pricing term, where it's basically creating a fence around certain types of customers. And what's important with fencing is it needs to be clear and it has to be accepted by the customers. So you want the fence to be it can't be something that we can just, like you go back to the sites or the locations discussion. That often is problematic because they'll say, well, we have 3 manufacturing sites, but we have 1 office, then we have this guy that works remotely, and it's kind of gray as to how many sites they have. So you want to avoid that when it comes to fences. You want the fence to be super clear, super understandable, and accepted by the customer. And this allows you to have different pricing models for businesses or organizations within these fenced areas, and allows you to do that without alienating the other customer groups. And you don't want to confuse this with market segmentation where you're saying, bigger companies pay more than smaller companies. That is not a fence because it's arbitrary where you're saying like a company above $500 million in revenue pays more than a company under $500 million. So those types of things are different pricing principles of market segmentation. So fences, you could think of for-profit companies could have a certain pricing structure. Government bodies could have a pricing structure, educational institutions like universities or nonprofit. So those are some fences where, it's binary. You either are a for-profit company, publicly or privately traded, regardless, or you're a government body. You can't be both, right? So that's a fence that's, in our opinion, clear, it would be accepted by the customer, and would allow you to have different pricing models based on these organizational types. And it doesn't have to be these ones, these are just some examples. But fencing is a very powerful pricing principle that really allows you to create more tailored offerings that will ultimately drive more subscribers and more revenue. The second core principle around pricing that's I think probably more commonly understood is market segmentation or ladders. Basically, you want to increase the sales or the revenue by offering more value. You see this in all sorts of products, whether you're buying a car and you want the leather seats, you want the seat warmers, etc. You pay a premium for that. And there are ways for publishers to do this. Here we have some examples of going from a retail PDF or a single PDF, offering subscriptions with historical records and redline and change management, AI tools around chat and interactive standards, XML versions of the standards, and then ultimately a full requirements management tool that some SDOs have built out themselves and some partners like ourselves offer. So these ladders allow you to drive more value for the customer, potentially charge more, and generate more revenue. And Nimonik, we have a policy of if we're going to create more value on top of your standards, we're more than happy to share that revenue through a royalty model. And we've implemented that with chatbot and some XML things where we're trying to drive more value for the customer and more revenue. And so you want to present this to the other important part of ladders is it needs to be understood by the customer as a journey. Like you start here and you can end up here. So you start with your PDF, which everybody understands, and then you progressively take them in on this journey where they're getting more value and leveraging the standards to improve their business. And it's a journey that might take years. They might take years to move up this ladder, but they do over time. And so the ladder needs to correspond to a journey that the company can go on. And of course, there's other things you could add to this type of ladder approach, but this is just one example. So yeah, I already mentioned we offer XML versions of certain standards, again, with the approval of our publishing partners. A lot of SDOs and NSBs have created XML versions of their documents or interactive versions of documents, but they're not really being used. And I think there the challenge is often the delivery tool. And we think Nimonik has a decent delivery tool. So there we charge a premium for the XML version, say another 20% on top of the PDF, but the royalties are paid on that new higher value. So you basically increase your royalty payments by 20% or so. Chatbots, so AI, some publishers are developing their own. We're building some with some publishers, and the idea is to sell those as a value-added service. We have a secure AI that's all within our infrastructure, IP protected. And I think on the chatbot topic, I've mentioned this to some people, is it's important that we get ahead of the curve, because already if you go to ChatGPT and you ask questions about certain standards, it gives you pretty detailed answers to the point where you can argue about copyright infringement, and I know there are ongoing lawsuits around that. But you got to get ahead of the curve, because otherwise companies are going to start in one form or another using chatbots with your content without your approval. And it's going to be one of these leaky bucket situations where it's very difficult because the market itself is changing and people more and more are expecting the availability of chatbots to be kind of everywhere. So we're here to work with you to implement secure, strong chatbots that can be sold as a value-added product. And if you do it with us, or if you do it with somebody else, we advocate that you do this. And the third element where we add some value is creating linkages between the standards and regulations. And there's a small typo here. So with internal documents like engineering documents, permits, licenses, regulations, and potentially contracts. It should say contracts instead of other regulations. But if you have contracts that specify you need to meet certain standards, linking that back together, and then also linking with specification sheets and things of that nature that are built. So there's lots of opportunity, we feel, to add more value on top of standards. All right, I know I've covered a lot of content here. Please do feel free to put it into the chat, any questions. I know I'm going pretty quickly this morning, but I want to leave time for Q&A. So small companies versus large companies. Larger, higher ability to pay, more likely to have dedicated staff to manage libraries of standards. What we've noticed with some of these companies that don't have a subscription is they did not have a person or people that are there to manage the library. And we end up spending a lot of time educating them on the values of a subscription and then helping them consolidate, because what they do is they have to go out to all the people in the company, figure out which standards are being used, which standard have been purchased in retail. It's a pretty challenging process often for a company to first implement a subscription. And larger companies tend to respect copyright, intellectual property, but they will still use retail. And so once you get, it's in our opinion, it's more important to get them onto a subscription, even if it's a smaller one, than to put too many barriers in place where they don't do the subscription. It's an inertia to change. To go from retail to subscription is basically a decision to change, and companies struggle to change. So you want to make it as easy as possible for them to switch from retail to subscription, and then over time grow the subscription. So having a starter pack, some more flexible pricing for companies that are just getting started, that are net new revenue for you, can help them make that switch. And then thinking about some of your pricing models, whether it's sites or other things, and whether these are really helpful for driving revenue and subscriptions, or if they're perhaps have some negative impacts. So we talked a bit about power users and occasional users already. I won't belabor the point, but certainly some companies, they're going to have power users. They're typically willing to pay more for access to the standards that the power users need. But when it comes to occasional users, that's where they'll start to sort of cut corners and say, hey, go buy it retail, or hey, use this document that we have somehow obtained. So you want to think about the power user versus occasional user and how that maps to your pricing models. I think it is an important one. The occasional users will typically be the ones who resort to retail or piracy, or not buying the standard at all and trying to understand the standard through publicly available analysis of the standard, or through consultants, or through other things like that. All right, one thing we haven't talked about too much, let me just take a small pause or glass of water. Geographic pricing, or geographic-based pricing. Now, to my knowledge, I haven't seen any SDO or NSB offer different prices in different geographies. It doesn't mean it's not happening, but I haven't seen it. However, it is a pretty common practice in most subscription businesses. So the example down here of Spotify, music subscriptions, their pricing varies tremendously. It goes from 56 cents a month to $16 a month. So I think on the 56-cent side, it's countries like Nigeria, less wealthy countries where there's less respect for intellectual property. And on the $16 side, I think it's Switzerland. Switzerland's always the most expensive, where there's A, a lot of money, and B, respect for intellectual property. So geographic pricing, I'm not saying it's easy, but it has a lot of benefits. I think if you look at your customer base for subscribers, the vast majority of subscribers are going to be in the United States, in certain European countries, where there's that intellectual property respect and money, ability to pay. And then basically, as you go down that curve, you're going to see less and less subscribers. Doesn't mean there aren't companies who want to subscribe to your standards. It's just they can't afford it. They can't justify it internally. And geography is, to a certain extent, a fence. You can say, is your company headquartered in Nigeria? Is it headquartered in this country? And if you use a mix of fences and ladders, you can get a big company in Nigeria to pay more than a small company in Nigeria. So there are ways to tackle this and make it so that you can sell your subscriptions in more geographies. And you can think of all these different things. So market demand within a geography. The cost of production is probably not a big factor, since you're producing it centrally. Local competition, if there's adoptions, or piracy, you can think of piracy as local competition. Exchange rates. So if you're pricing in US dollars and the US dollar strengthens dramatically, that can have a very negative impact in certain geographies and their ability to pay. I know when South African companies contact us, or Turkish companies contact us, it's basically impossible for them to buy our services, because their currencies have depreciated so much that any service being provided by a US dollar-based company is basically unaffordable. So you got to think about that. Again, you're not going to be able to make everybody happy, or satisfy every geography, but these are realities of companies' abilities to pay. Local regulations, and then of course cultural factors, particularly respect for intellectual property, respect for the use of standards. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in geographic pricing that's not being tapped by the SDO and NSB market at this stage. So something to think about. Grandfathering. So when you do change prices, often companies will allow grandfathered pricing. So if you're on the old pricing model, you can stay on it. Generally, it's something you want to avoid, because what you end up doing is you're creating tiers of customers where they're on different pricing models. And if you're changing on, say, an annual basis, it can be very challenging to manage this over time. If you really want to do grandfathering, what you probably want to do is do these cohorts where you say you're on the 2020 pricing model, you're on the 2021 pricing model, and at least have a very clear break and label those customers to know which sort of cohorts they're in. But the best is to try and avoid grandfathering, and to do that, you want to do progressive and modest changes. If you come in and do a massive price increase, for sure you got to grandfather some of the older clients if you don't want to deal with the headache of losing some of them. So doing modest and progressive changes is, in our opinion, a best practice compared to waiting 5 years and then realizing, oh my God, we haven't changed our prices in 5 years. We need to increase prices by 40%. Some other ideas for net new revenue: advertisement supported standards distribution. So a lot of companies offer both an advertisement driven offering and a paid offering. Again, you can think of Netflix, Spotify, Disney Plus. They often have an ad-based one that's cheaper, but then supplemented with ads. You can also think of the distribution of use of your standards. So most SDOs have certain standards that are very popular and highly used, and then they have a whole bunch that are not used that much. And so perhaps there's opportunity around some of the less used standards to offer them at a reduced price or free of charge, but generate some revenue through advertisement. These are just ideas. To my knowledge, nobody's really done this. The market opportunity is maybe not massive, but it's just get those creative juices flowing about how can we monetize some of the content that maybe is not being sold very actively. And it also can help you increase awareness of these less used standards. So the less used standards, if people aren't buying them, to a certain extent, they don't know about them. And then potentially you can advertise things like learning products related to these standards, some of your other services. So you say the standard's free, but we're running ads, and to get it, maybe you need to fill in your contact information. You get the standard for free, but then you get some marketing material around learning products or other services that the SDOs and NSBs offer. So you want to just kind of think about that based on the catalog of information you're selling. We've talked about transparency. So you want to make your costs visible. Very often we get people saying, hey, why do standards even cost money in the first place? Why aren't they free? And we have to explain to them, well, they cost money to develop them. There's overhead, there's the organizations, there's the technical committees, the approval process. But making some of those costs visible in your pricing models can be interesting, where you say, here's our sort of SDO management fee for developing the standard. And then you have a fee on top of that for specific standards that have a certain value or a certain need in the marketplace. And this is done in certain industries. I think of an airline. You buy an airplane ticket, you'll see the price for the ticket, but then within that, you'll typically see the taxes, airport fees, luggage surcharge, things of that nature. And it at least gives the customer some visibility as to, hey, what's driving this price? It's not just the airline, it's the airports, it's the fuel charges, it's the carbon tax, depending on the jurisdiction you're in. So there are ways to make those costs visible and improve transparency with the end user. So I think a couple slides to conclude here. What do we believe at Nimonik and what do we advocate for? It's that publishers should actively control and align the pricing of their publications with best practices. It's your material, it's your intellectual property. You want to optimize that. This does require effort, resources, research, communication. We're here to help. I'm happy to have discussions in more detail. We have some partners that are very good at pricing. So some ideas for you is you can establish a pricing committee. So it's a team of people at your organization that are responsible for doing this research, collecting the data, proposing new pricing models. You can use this committee to organize discussions and conduct surveys, propose changes. You can bring in external consulting experts, consultants who can help with this process, and then identify areas for improvement and develop a plan to implement. And you want to review your pricing models, I would say, at least annually, or every 2 years at a bare minimum. It's just a healthy exercise because the market is changing, your partners are changing, everything's changing. So this is just a sample pricing survey that you can, it's a very popular one that's very commonly used, where basically they ask 4 questions of, what price, at what price do you feel this is expensive? At what price do you feel this is not a bargain, meaning it's a little bit expensive, not expensive at all, or just outright too cheap? And you ask these 4 questions, and you kind of plot it on this graph that we see here, and you create this range of acceptable prices. So the green box here is sort of the universe of acceptable prices, and it's going to vary again by customer on a variety of factors. And you have your point of marginal cheapness, or the product is priced too cheap and you're losing revenue. The point of marginal expensiveness, where you're right at the limit, and for a lot of customers it will be too expensive and they won't buy it. And then actually your optimal price point is around here, which is, this is what's going to allow you to drive the most revenue, because you're going to have more buyers or more subscribers at this price point. So your volume is going to increase a lot. You're going to, and find the right pricing there. And this can be tweaked to, again, if you use that combination of fences, so you can do this survey within for-profit companies, you can do it within government entities, but it's a very common pricing survey. We didn't invent this, but it's one tool amongst many to try and figure out correct pricing. All right, so last few takeaways before we wrap up. So there's no silver bullet. Pricing is going to be based on your data, your users. So you got to do it yourself. You want to stay flexible and have a data-driven approach where you're gathering information and constantly tweaking and improving. You want to have smart subscriptions that are mapped to the organizations you serve, that allow people to switch from retail to subscription. It's more than just about money. So, of course, this is about driving revenue, but it's also a way of communicating the value of your products and making sure that customers understand that it costs money to develop standards, maintain standards, and there's inherent value in standards. So it's not just a way to drive revenue, it's a communication tool. And you want to think about that as you're developing your pricing model. Get a dance partner. So we're here to dance with you. We're here to work with you to provide our insights and information so that you can improve your marketing and improve your pricing models. But I think it takes 2 to tango. We have a certain vantage point. Other organizations have other vantage points. You want to pull that together to get the right mix for you. And then set your calendar, meaning make it clear that you want to review pricing at a certain frequency. Maybe you put in place that pricing committee, maybe you bring in some experts, and the general industry practice that is recommended is to look at this at least annually, to try and improve and tweak it over time, because it will change. So I think that's it. Big thank you for everybody who joined us today, and certainly have a look at the white paper we shared in the slides, and we are certainly happy to go into more details.